their audio and shutting off their camera so that the only thing anybody sees is the teacher.
Okay.
So,
All right.
good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Starting to wonder if we should keep doing this or not, given how many people are here. But they maybe didn't realize. I still have stuff I want to say, so if you guys are good with it, I'm going to keep going.
Yeah.
Well, you did say last time, maybe you wouldn't have it today, and if they don't look at their
Yeah.
consent, then
Yeah.
Do we have paper?
So let me. Yeah, I'll just.
Okay.
So Sylvia's right. The last time we had class was 2 weeks ago before we went on our trip for our anniversary. And I did say that I wasn't sure if we were going to have class today because I didn't know if I'd have enough time to pull things together after we got back. I didn't have enough time to pull together a normal lesson, the way that we would normally do a lesson with the notes and stuff. But there are some just sort of miscellaneous things related to this issue of the Bible and the text and translation, etc., that I want to kind of talk about. So you don't have any notes, and if this only takes a half an hour, then we're done early and we can, talk or do whatever. Or if you guys have questions, and if it goes longer than that, fine. But it's going to be a little bit of a different thing. So I'm just going to title this sort of miscellaneous thoughts about the King James Bible and the Bible issue. Okay. So the first thing, last time we were here, 2 weeks ago, I taught a lesson on the Great Bible. And we talked about how the Great Bible gets its name because of its size, because it was a large, a volume of the largest size, etc. And we talked about that. So one of the things I thought would be interesting to do is to bring in a Bible and show you something. So this Bible here, this massive Bible. This is a family Bible. This thing was published in 1876. It's very heavy, and if I could show the page without ripping it, this is dated. This is a centennial Bible. This was published to celebrate the 100-year centennial of the United States, and it was done in 1876. Okay, so this thing is massive, and if my math is right, I think it's actually bigger than the Great Bible was. So remember we talked about that last time, that the Great Bible was big, no doubt, but by the standards of today, it still wasn't overtly huge or gaudy or whatever, okay? So this Bible belonged to Becky's grandma. I can't figure out exactly how the family came to possess this particular Bible. But a number of years ago, she gave it to me and thought I would get more use out of it than she would. And so it's certainly an extremely interesting, volume to have. I want to show you a couple things about it, though. There's not a lot of space up here right now. This is a King James Bible. It was published in 1876. Before there were really modern versions. Now, Mike has a Webster Bible there. That Bible was published in like the 1830s or something. 1830s or something like that. And in large part, the Webster Bible was an updating of the spelling and orthography of the King James Bible, by and large. But even that Bible, while it was available, most people didn't use it. Most people were still using the King James Bible, and it was called, at the time, the Common English Bible. Okay? Now, here's what I want you to see about this particular Bible. So, you see all this stuff right here? This is all front material. None of this is biblical text. The biblical text doesn't start until you get all the way here to the book of Genesis. Okay? So this thing is designed to be, this is not the kind of Bible that you would like bring to church with you and put on your lap and have with you when you were teaching or trying to study along with the pastor. But all that is front material that is added for study, for research, etc. Now, I actually want to show you a couple things in this. So, when we think about the King James Bible in America, there's a there's a long history of the printed text in the United States and what kinds of things were included in Bibles, how words were spelled, all sorts of things. So this is just pictures, all woodcut pictures that are printed about showing just elements of Jewish antiquity, right? Things that people might not have any point of reference to. There's all these pictures in here like this. And then I'll try to find some of these. I should have marked these ahead of time. They shouldn't be too hard to find, but there's also like gold leaf with what I think is actually gold leaf ink. So here's an example. This is the furniture of the tabernacle and the high priest. Okay, you can see it's all color ink. It's got, it looks like gold leaf ink to me on some of these things. So my surmising is that this was not a cheap Bible to buy, even back in the, by the standards of that time. Here's another picture, similar, of the tabernacle in the wilderness. So you have these sort of full color images that were printed in this Bible. In all of this front material. So, the text of the King James Bible itself was never copyrighted in the United States. But all this ancillary material that is added to these Bibles, these publishers were definitely interested in copyrighting that information. So here's the holy vessels of the tabernacle and the temple. Yeah, it is pretty small print, but you can see again that there are these colored gold leaf inlay pages in this Bible. Here's another one that shows the dress of the high priest.
So you can see it showing.
Yeah. So again, this is an American publishing from 1876.
Who was the publisher?
The publisher,
No.
Chandler Brothers, and it says here that they're out of Rockford, Illinois. So some of the issues related to this Bible are covered in my book, The King James Bible in America. This particular edition is already changing the way some words are spelled. So for example, throughly is not spelled throughly, it's spelled thoroughly. Always is not spelled always, it's spelled always. And so that's happening, back so this is even before the publication of the critical text by Westcott and Hort. This is before the publication of any modern versions. American publishers were moving to Americanize the spellings of a lot of these words before all that stuff came about with modern versions. But again, I'll kind of leave this out, and if you guys want to look at it afterwards, feel free to do that. But there's a lot of stuff in here that is just, this volume was clearly designed to be something that somebody would have in their home and use it to study from. Okay? Any questions about that? All right. So, there's some things that have been rolling around in my mind. As I study certain things, I run across miscellaneous information, okay? In other words, information that I find interesting but isn't really fitting into whatever it is that we're going through at a given time, and so I don't really talk about it. One of the things that I kind of want to go through today and talk about today a little bit is some things about the history of what we might consider to be the King James only movement. And the only notes I have are this one page here of handwritten notes, okay? So, it was really, so the first modern version of any consequence appeared in 1881, the Revised Version. Okay, the Revised Version appears in 1881, and it appears in Great Britain. Give a few years, 1901, there's an American one. American Standard, I can't remember what they called it, but it's essentially the same thing, okay? So, before this point, The only Bible that was really being read or used by, we'll say, specifically American Christians, but we could expand that and say English-speaking Christians, was essentially the King James Bible. There wasn't really anything else available. Webster had done one in the United States, but it wasn't real popular, and not too many people were reading it, unless the only real competing things would have been Bibles in other languages, other language translations for people who spoke German or something like that. But they're not really challenging, obviously, the English market, because the King James was, sort of reigned supreme in that market. And in fact, I have books at home that talk about the King James Bible in the 1800s, and they call it the Common English Bible. Well, why are they calling it the Common English Bible? They're calling it the Common English Bible because that's the Bible everybody what? That's the Bible everybody read, right? Everybody who went to church, everybody who had a Bible, like this, this family edition that I showed you from 1876, they're all reading what translation? They're all reading the King James, okay? Once modern versions start to come onto the scene, they do not immediately replace the King James Bible as far as its reverence and so forth within the English-speaking world, and especially not in the United States, okay? It is after World War II when we start to see the neo-evangelical movement. This is a movement that I talked a lot about in the Grace History Project. When we start to see the neo-evangelical movement. So this would be Billy Graham, this would be the people out of Fuller Theological Seminary in California, etc. After World War II, when they start going out on their evangelistic crusades and so forth, they start promoting modern what? Modern versions, okay? So the King James only movement, the way that we understand it today, the way that people who use that terminology today think about the King James only movement, we need to understand that it is essentially a post-World War II movement, okay? You following me? Now, before that, before World War II, there were a few modern versions around, but essentially not too many people were what? We're using them because people generally held to the King James Bible. So I want to give you some documentation of that, some historical documentation of what I'm talking about, okay? So the first book I want you to look at here is a book. This is a book by a person named Spencer, A History of Kentucky Baptists, Volume 2, and this was published in 1885, okay? Now, I want you to look at, let me find this section here. So this is talking about a county in Kentucky in 1838, I should say. So this book is written in 1885, but it's talking about something that happened in Kentucky in 1838. So nearly, give or take, 50 years earlier, okay? But notice what it says. Under his advice and the leadership of William Cross, 4 fragments of churches bearing the names of Jordan, Clear Folk, 76, and Lime Creek met by their messengers at Clear Folk Meeting House in Clinton County on the 17th of November, 1838, for the purpose of forming an association. So this is a group of Baptist churches that are going to form now a new sort of Baptist association. And if you know anything about it, are there like a bunch of them? There's a bunch of different ones that are out there, right? Now look what it says. A constitution was adopted, one article of which read thus, quote, "The churches comprising this association shall stand in the same relation to each other as an individual members do each other in churches." Article 2D of the abstract of the principles reads as follows. We believe the scriptures of the Old and New Testament as translated by King James to be the Word of God and the only rule of faith and practice. You see that? Now, is that a quote King James only statement?
Yes.
That is a King James only statement being made when? 1838. But remember, were there any other options really out there at that point? Now, I don't mean to say with that statement that if there had been another option, they would have chose that option. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying they are making a statement like this at a period in history where there was not a massive incursion of modern versions for the King James to compete with. So did these people have God's Word in English and believe it to be the Word of God and the only rule of faith and practice? They did, and they believed it when? In 1838. Is everybody with that? Okay. In 1917, a gentleman named, last name of Riley, wrote a book called The Menace of Modernism. And in this section here on page 9, he talks about what he calls the old conception. All right, so don't read it. Listen to what I'm going to say. We'll read it in a minute. Let me explain what he means by the old conception. So he's writing this book in 1917. This is right in the period of time, in the early 20th century, when the arguments and debates between the fundamentalists and the modernists were beginning. Okay? The fundamentalists believed that the Bible was the Word of God without error. The modernists questioned all that stuff, right? So when he's talking about the old conception, he's talking about the way people used to conceive of things before the modern debate between fundamentalism and modernism that he's writing this book to address began. Okay? So, these Kentucky Baptists, for example, in this Spencer book here that we just read about in 1838, these folks would be an example of what the other guy in 1917 is calling the, quote, old what? The old conception, okay? So the old conception is designed to explain the way people used to think about these things before the fundamentalist modernist controversy started, okay? So does that make sense? Does everybody understand what I'm saying here, okay? So let's look at what they say. This is Riley now. Our text speaks of both the old and new. So he's quoting here from Hebrews, God who at sundry times in diverse manners spake in time past unto the fathers by the prophets. Let me scroll down here. Now watch what he says. There are at least three features of the old conception, each of which has now what? Passed away. Meaning what? Gone. People don't think this way what? Anymore. All right? They are first, that the Bible was finished in heaven and handed down. It's the first one. So that would be the issue of inspiration. Right? That God's Word was eternally settled in heaven, and that He handed it down to men by the issue of revelation and inspiration. Is everybody with that? Second, that the King James Version was absolutely what? Inerrant. So let me ask you a question. Does this piece by Spencer, which documents their doctrinal statement from 1838, bear witness and testify to the truth of what the other gentleman is saying in 1917 used to be a belief of the old conception? So did people, before the fundamentalist modernist controversy, did they believe, second, that the King James Version was absolutely inerrant? That's what they believed. Were they believing that before there was a textual and translational controversy? So in other words, the average Christian, do they know anything about the things that the guys in the ivory towers are arguing about? The average Christian had no idea, right? So they had this belief that the King James Version was absolutely inerrant. And then third, this is interesting, third, that its literal acceptance and interpretation was alone correct. So there you have the literal hermeneutic, right? The fundamental principle of dispensational Bible study, that you interpret the Bible how? So the old conception before the modernist fundamentalist controversies of the late 19th and early 20th centuries maintained a belief in inspiration, maintained the belief in the inerrancy of an English translation, and maintained the belief that that English translation needed to be interpreted how? Literally, okay? And he's writing this book in 1917. Okay? So, as time goes on, more and more people are going to start laying aside. It's a trickle at first, but after World War II, it picks up steam with the neo-evangelical movement. More and more people are going to start laying aside the King James Bible and replace it with what? But you need to understand, that didn't happen overnight. It's not like somebody went to the light switch in 1881 and turned the light on and everyone's like, yes, we finally have a new Bible. That's not what happened. In fact, I have tons of documentation about reviews of the Revised Version in 1881 that are extremely negative of it and are forecasting what the impact of it would be upon the believing church. All right? So, is everybody with me so far? I know it's a little bit more random than what you guys are used to, so it's all up here that I'm trying to, make it make sense. Anybody have any questions about what I've said so far? So, as more and more people, as this movement away from the King James to modern versions starts to occur, at first it's a trickle. Then it's a creek. Then it's a river. And before you know it, is it just the way things are? You following that illustration, right? So it starts as a trickle, it feeds into a creek, it becomes a river, and then it's a massive lake or an ocean, and now, everyone's got their own thing, like the situation we find ourselves in now today. Okay? Now, when that trickle starts to happen, some books start to be written. So I'm going to go over here, and I think this will show up on there. Hopefully. I will if I write here. So, 1924, a guy named Philip Morrow writes a book called Which Version? Whoops. He writes a book called Which Version? And this is Morrow. So let me show you that. Pretty sure I called that up. So that's this book right here. Which Version? Authorized and revised by Philip Morrow. That book shows up in 1924. Okay? Now think this through with me. I just quoted to you from Riley, who wrote a book in 1917 talking about what the old conception used to be, right? And now we have this book show up in 1924 called Which Version by Morrow, and it's about authorized or revised, right? So what does that tell you? That tells you that in the 1920s, is there beginning to be question about the Revised Version versus the King James, at least in the United States. Is everybody with me? Okay? In 1930, we're going to see a book here show up that we've already talked about a lot in previous lessons, which is Our Authorized Bible Vindicated by the Seventh-day Adventist Wilkinson. Okay, so this, remember we've talked about this. This is the first Bible to introduce this, the first book to introduce this idea of there being two streams of Bibles. Okay, remember we talked about that when we went through some things a while back. Okay, so that's 1930. The next one there's other little pamphlets and things that are written. Let me show you this timeline. I found this website that kind of gives a timeline of some of these things. There are a few small pamphlets that are written, but nothing of any massive significance as far as book length works. There's a few things that happen. Here's 1930, and the Seventh-day Adventist Benjamin Wilkinson and his book there. And then if you fast forward in the 30s, there's a few little things that are written, pamphlets, not necessarily books. So there's one more thing in the 30s, one more thing in the 40s, and then when we get into the 1950s now, we start to see, we really begin to see now an influx in material that's going to be written about this, okay? So in 1955, Jasper James Ray is going to write, God wrote only one Bible. So this is J.J. Ray. He writes that in 1955. Remember what we've already studied. Did Ray plagiarize Wilkinson? Shake your head yes, because I already taught you that. You all remember that, right? Yeah. I ought to give you guys more tests so you remember things better. Okay? Then in 1956, the King James Version Defended is written. That is written by Edward F. Hills. Okay? So he's a Seventh-day, Wilkinson's a Seventh-day Adventist guy. Ray is a Baptist, fundamental Baptist guy. And Hills is a Presbyterian. Teaches at Westminster Theological Seminary. Went to, he of all these guys, he is by far the most highly educated guy that enters into this sort of foray here. Okay? So we got that in 1956. You have another little booklet in 1956. You have another brief one-page thing in 1959. In England, in 1961, Ian Paisley, okay, in 1961, Ian Paisley writes the New English Bible, Version or Perversion. And then M.R. DeHaan does a small booklet in 1962. But is in 1964, Ruckman is going to write Bible Babble. Okay? No, that's just me not being able to talk and spell at the same time. So he writes, does I still spell it wrong? Bible. So, I want you to see something here. So, does Ruckman use Ray? Shake your head yes, I already taught you this. Okay? Ruckman uses Ray there, as if you're following the progression. In 1967, Hills is going to write another book called Believing Bible Study. And that's going to be by Hills again. He's writing that. Now, just look at what we have so far. When do we start to see the pace of writing on this subject pick up? The 1950s and the 19 what? Now, why would that be based upon what I've already told you? What's happening after World War II? The new evangelicals are starting to promote what? Modern versions, which is now prompting a response from fundamentalism. You with me? Okay, this is historiography here, guys. You know what that means? That means we're taking the books, I've taken all the books and I've read them in the order they were written to understand the thought development of what's happening here. You understand what I'm saying? So instead of just jumping in and reading this book, which would be perfectly fine to do if you wanted to, if you just wanted to read that book, I've read all these books in the order they were written. Because what I wanted to do was not just know what was in the books, I wanted to understand how this is being what? How this is being developed over time. You following that? Okay. Now, then in 1970, David Otis Fuller is going to write which Bible? Now remember, does Fuller quote Wilkinson for over 138 pages and obscure his identity from his readers as a Seventh-day Adventist? Shake your head yes, I taught you that already too. Is this ringing any bells?
Yeah.
Okay. Phew. Thanks. Thanks for making me feel better about myself. 1970, same year, Ruckman is going to write Handbook of Manuscript, I'm just going to abbreviate that, Manuscript Evidence. Again, and so this is Ruckman. He's going to write that book in 1970. In 1973, Fuller is going to write True or False. And in 1975, Fuller is going to write Counterfeit or Genuine. And again, that's Fuller. Now, for the sake of time, I'm going to stop my list there. But if you keep going into the 1980s, you're going to encounter guys like Sam Gipp. You're going to encounter guys like William P. Grady. You're going to encounter guys like Floyd Nolan Jones. You're going to encounter guys like David Cloud. These guys show up in the 80s and are writing about that, among others. In the 1990s, who shows up? You've got Ripplinger, shows up in 1992, writing New Age Bible versions. You've got Dr. Thomas Holland writing a book, Crowned with Glory. You have R.B. Olette, which never spell his name right. He writes a book. And you've got all sorts of people now in the 80s and 90s that are joining this and writing books about this topic. Okay? Is everybody with that? So can we look at this chronology and understand why that's happening? That's happening because after World War II, the neo-evangelicals are starting to promote what? Modern versions, and so this is prompting a response from fundamentalism. And early on, a lot of this stuff gets plagiarized and moved forward in ways that then it becomes the standard fare of the movement, okay? But here's the other thing I want to go back to make sure everybody is getting this, okay? When these Kentucky Baptists said this, did they say it in a different historical context and time period than these guys writing all these books? Absolutely, they did. When they said this in 1838, they weren't dealing with all the stuff these guys are dealing with because of the historical context and setting that they lived in back here in 1838, right? When this guy, Riley, in The Menace of Modernism, is talking about the Old Conception, and he says the second point of the Old Conception was that the King James Version was absolutely inerrant, was that was referring to the belief before all this stuff, right? Before 1881, before 1901, before what? World War II, right? All right, so I should stop there and see if anybody has a question. So either you don't want to say, or this is making perfect sense.
So when the American Standard Version came out in 1901, was it popular? Or?
No. It was not. It was not popular. Americans were still reading the King James Bible. This is 1901. This statement was made in 1917. Okay, so that's when you start, I will say this though, Mike, okay? That's when you start to beginning to see that trickle maybe starting. But it is not widespread, and there are not very many American Christians that are in 1901 laying aside the King James Bible to pick up the American Standard. The preachers in the churches, everybody is still preaching from what? I should add to this, in the American Grace Movement, debates about Bible versions and textual issues start happening in the GGF in the 1960s. Why would that be? Because what's happening in the 1960s? People are laying aside the King James in favor of what? Modern versions. So now these things start to show up in the churches as people start to begin to debate and argue about these things. Okay? Did you have another question, Mike?
The Bibles that were put into hotels, you know the one I mean.
The Gideons?
Gideons, what version?
Those were King James Bibles. Until recently. If you go now, they're ESVs. I've been in 2 hotels, and I check in every hotel I go in what kind of Bible it is, and I've seen ESVs. I just do that. I've been in 2 hotels in the last 3 years where the Bible in the drawer was an ESV, not a King James. Placed there by the Gideons. Okay? Now, if I erase this, will everybody remember this? Because I got one more point I want to make. Everybody good here? Okay. Now, so up here we have things starting in a trickle. They become a creek, and then in the 1950s and 60s, you just have a torrent now of information coming out about this issue. A lot of it is repetitive and repeating things that were said previously, and so this train, if you want to call it that for the sake of illustration, is leaving the station. Okay? Meanwhile, over here, across the pond, if you will, in merry old England, some primary source documents are being discovered that speak to the translation process that the King James translators actually used. Okay? This train is leaving the station without any awareness of this information that's being uncovered in the libraries of England, in Great Britain at the time. Okay? So, this stream of thought is going to be largely ignorant of what I'm going to put over here. Okay? You with me? So what I'm going to put over here are things that were uncovered in the 1950s and 1960s in British libraries. They were found bound to other things. They were sort of rumored to have existed, but they were actually found and began to be studied, okay? Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about these 3 things in the order that information was published on them in, not necessarily in the order they were discovered. Does that make sense? Okay? In 1969, Ward Allen is going to publish this book right here. Translating for King James. Notes made by a translator of the King James Bible. These are the notes of John Boyce. John Boyce is one of the 10 to 12 gentlemen who sat on the final stage of the King James Bible process. Okay? So here are his notes in his handwriting, and here is a translation and written and typed in English so that you can actually, read and understand his handwriting. This was discovered by scholars in a British library, and it was published by Ward Allen in 1969. Okay, so I'm going to write this up here, Translating for King James. Okay, and this is Ward Allen, who is responsible for this. All right, so this is the handwritten notes of John Boyce in the final stage of the process. These were known to have existed but had been lost to history until they were discovered in a cache of documents in a library in Great Britain. They were studied and they were printed for the first time in a format that somebody could have got their hands on in 1969. Okay, now let me ask you a question. Has that train already left the station? And it left the station without a working knowledge of this document. Are you following that? Okay? The second one is 1977. Translating the New Testament epistles. This is also done by Allen. And this was found at Lambeth Palace in England, this document. Okay, so let me show you that. This is the only one of these that I have in digital format because this book is extremely rare and hard to find. Translating the New Testament Epistles, 1604 to 1611, a manuscript from the King James Westminster Company. So this is the company of translators that was tasked with translating the New Testament epistles. All right? These are their notes reflecting a stage in the translation process. All right? And you can see very clearly, this is edited by Ward Allen, and when is it published? So this is primary source documentation of how the translators went about the job and the task of what? Translating. When is this published in any kind of a format that anybody can really read it or handle it or know what's in it? It is not published until 19 what? Very good year. That's the year I was born. Has this train already left the station when that's published in 1977? So any insight, any information that's available from the primary source documents of the translators themselves, have these guys already left the station without that information? So we see it once in the notes of John Boyce, and we see it a second time in manuscript 98 and their work on the translation. Now, I'm going to just show you this. We will study this in more detail later on. But here you can see, this is based upon their annotation. So here's the verse. Here's what they wrote for this particular, I don't know for sure which verse this is. I have to look more closely. But here's what they wrote in the margin for the annotation. And then here's what they ultimately settled it with. So this is a study of their actual notations that they wrote in manuscript 98 for what the readings should be. Are you following me? Okay? And then the last document, again, so all of these are discovered or uncovered in British libraries in that roughly in that time period, the 50s and the 60s. Unless you flew over there and had academic privileges in these libraries, you would have no idea that this is going on until these works are what? Published. Okay, now I will add that this one, the Notes of John Boyce, Allen published about his work on this in 1966 in a very popular magazine read by the majority of everybody called the Renaissance News. Who reads the Renaissance News? A bunch of egghead scholars that have a PhD in Renaissance studies or something like this, right? So it's not made available for anybody to handle until he publishes what? The book. Okay? Then the next one is 1995. The Coming of the King James Gospels. And again, Allen is the main editor. 1995. Okay, now let me talk to you about this. By the way, here's my copy of that. Really ugly cover. The Coming of the King James Gospels, a collation of the work in progress. All right? Let me see if I can show you a picture here. What this does, one of the documents that was uncovered is a document called it's a document called BOD 1602. And it's short for, why it's called that, of course. Let's see if I can find a picture in this. Okay, here we go. That's a picture of it. So this is a bishop's Bible, a 1602 bishop's Bible, with the handwritten notations of the translators in the margins. This was discovered back here. What Ward Allen has done after studying the document is produce it in print so that you can see and read what these different notations are and how they impact the text. Okay? So let me say a few things about this. Rule number 1 given to the translators was to follow the bishop's Bible unless the truth of the original determined otherwise. So to facilitate rule number 1, King James ordered the printer, the king's printer, to print 40 unbound copies of the bishop's Bible, a 1602 bishop's Bible, and distribute them to the translating companies. Okay? So when you see these annotations here, this being underlined, this crossed out, and something else written in the margin, this is their actual work in annotating a bishop's Bible that is available for you to look at. Okay? $19.95. Has this train way left the station a long time ago by the time you get to 1995? So what am I saying to you? I'm saying to you that the modern King James only movement as we know it today was formed and forged without an understanding of the primary documents themselves that open up your understanding of what they actually did. Are you following this? As a result, there is much that is said in this stream of thought that really needs to be rethought and revised in light of the actual historical what? Evidence. Now there are some people who don't understand this, and they think that when I write a book like this, that I'm somehow undermining the King James Bible and trying to question its authority, and that I'm somehow covertly taking up for modern versions and these kinds of things. That's not at all what I'm doing. What I am endeavoring to do is to clean up the King James argumentation based upon actual, real, what? Evidence. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So all of this happens in response to the neo-evangelical movement, but all of that happens without a working knowledge of these primary documents that explain to us and teach us and give us clues into what they actually did and how they did it and why they did it the way they did it. And I would add to that the following. There are people today who refuse to look at these things, refuse to acknowledge them as and take them into account into their understanding of what they believe about the King James Bible, because it might mean that some of the long-standing rhetoric of the movement might have to be what? Revised. No one's talking here at Grace Life Bible Church or in any of the books that I'm writing about getting rid of the King James Bible. What we're talking about here is having an accurate historical understanding of the King James Bible based on facts and evidence, not based upon emotion and superstition. Does that make sense? Okay, so I somehow was able to get a 15-minute lesson out of all that. Does anybody have any questions or comments?
So I would take for granted that all this translating done by Allen backs the King James Version and
Oh, yeah.
solidifies that even more.
Yes.
The arguments at that.
What it does is it unlocks your understanding or pulls open the curtain to see behind the translation and understand what they did and how they did it. And none of it undermines the King James Bible. It should revise your understanding of it. Not to the negative, but to the positive. Does that make sense? So when we get to the point where we are talking about these things, and by the way, this document here, this is called BOD 1602. The reason it's called that is because of the library that it's in. I have it written down here. I can't remember the name of it. It's in, where'd it go? I guess I didn't write it down. Oh, Bodleian, or Bodleian or Bodleian Library at Corpus Christi College, Oxford. That's where it is. They have it. It is now studied. Books have been printed on it like the one I just showed you, okay? So you've got, this talks about the New Testament Gospels. Manuscript 98 talks about the New Testament epistles, and the notes of John Boyce talk about the final stage of the revision and the final stage of the translating process when they all sat in a room and read the text out loud. So all this stuff has been made available. It is my contention and my belief that all this stuff needs to be studied and taken into account to not do away with our belief in the King James Bible as God's Word for English-speaking people, but solidify that belief in a factual, evidentiary way, because a lot of what was said by that in that stream of thought is not true. It is not correct. It is not the way it is. It does not cohere with the facts. Because it was said without a knowledge of what? These documents. All right, so if there are no other questions, we can be done. Does anybody have anything else they want to mention?
So the Bibles that follow the Tyndale Matthew's Bible, the Great Bible, Geneva Bible, and Bishop's Bible, do they all basically have the Tyndale text? I mean, are they just...
Yes, so when John Rogers in the Matthew's Bible moves forward all of Tyndale's stuff into a printed volume, what we're studying right now, and we'll pick up next week, Coverdale in the Great Bible takes all that and moves that forward into the first licensed and only licensed English Bible, the Great Bible. So then when the Bishop's Bible is done in the 1560s, it's a revision of the Great Bible. And the King James Bible is a revision of the Bishop's Bible. All of which are in that Tyndalian line because of what John Rogers did with the Matthew's Bible. Does that make sense? So here's the other thing you need to get. When the King James translators sit down to do this, they're not starting with a blank piece of paper. They're starting with a text that was printed and given to them by the king's printer, and they are tasked with the job of revising that 1602 Bishop's Bible. Just like these images demonstrate. That's the facts of the case. They weren't sitting here like waiting for some sort of divine impartation of knowledge to translate the Bible. They are having discussions in real time around what's already there, looking at concordances and lexicons and printed editions of the Textus Receptus and commentaries and all available evidence to them as they discuss their way through here. But they are annotating an existing Bible and changing it improving it, changing it, doing what they need to do. That's the reality of what happened. They're not just sitting there with a blank page starting from scratch. Now, are they looking at the Geneva Bible? Yes. Are they looking, shock of shocks, are they looking at the Catholic Reims Bible? Yes. I know that doesn't fit the narrative, but there are Reims, and we'll talk about this and I'll prove it to you. There are some Reims readings in a King James Bible that the translators got from the Reims Bible. Which, according to, a lot of stuff we've looked at over here so far, that's like heresy. But that's a fact. That's a historical, provable, objective fact. Okay? Anybody else?
You said it was 80% is Tyndale?
83% of the New Testament of the King James Bible is William Tyndale. The percentage is less in the Old Testament because Tyndale never finished the Old Testament. Okay, so that's going to impact the data on the Old Testament. But there's that Tyndalian line going all the way through there. Okay, and my position and my belief is that what we need to do when we think about our King James Bible is we need to think about it accurately according to the facts that are available to us. And if we need to change and tweak some of our thoughts about it based upon things we learned from all this writing here, I don't see what's wrong with that. No one is advocating for laying it aside in favor of a modern version. I will never do that. Because I know that the critical text and modern versions differ substantively from the King James and alter the substantive doctrinal content of the Bible. Okay? All right, we got to quit though. Now we're to the point where we actually have to quit.